Hey guys, Rogerbrown here bringing this video. And with Kane's recent Legion review video on this channel, along with Chris Potter's review of Kill Jaden as a boss, we thought we'd take a little journey back in time to Warlords of Draenor and talk about the top 3 hardest bosses, along with a couple of honorable mentions in that expansion, and perhaps even more expansions in future videos. Now, before we get into this video, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you do enjoy this video, remember to subscribe and turn on the notifications to never miss out on any exciting method content. And a quick disclaimer before we get started here, because I can already hear the pitchforks in the background. I will be talking about methods perspective on these bosses when we actually first reach them, as a lot of these fights get altered or nerfed or just simply become trivialized with more gear as the expansion progresses. So it will just be initial impressions in this video. And without further ado, let's get started with number 3. Now, Warlords as a whole didn't really have many raids to speak of, but it did have one of my personal favorites of all time, the Blackrock Foundry. And in this raid there was the Blast Furnace. It was a considerably harder boss than all the previous ones in that raid, and basically a huge brick wall for guilds to get through. To put this into perspective, there were only 3 guilds that had managed to kill this boss, Method, Paragon and Midwinter, before BLACKHAND, the last boss of that raid, was killed. Now, onto the fight itself. Phase 1 was actually quite easy to get through. You just had to split your raid up into 2 sides, which is always interesting to have in a fight, and then use some clever mind control action on the engineers, trying to get as many bombs as possible to blow up the furnace and transition into phase 2. Of course, you had to also be killing off all the adds that came at you, and especially the big guys, the operators, which gave extra energy to the boss. More on that later. Now, once you got into phase 2, there was a big shift in the gameplay. Everyone stacked up and you just needed to kill the 4 primal elementalists to get into phase 3. But that required a lot of coordination. Using yet again mind controls, but this time on the security guards, and having them kill off the elementals while they were standing next to the primal elementalists made them drop their immunity for 20 seconds. So you had these small burst windows to finish them off, while again getting constantly swarmed with more and more adds from the sides. Then you got into phase 3 and you're thinking, this looks easy. No more adds coming, boss is not really doing much other than the melt debuff, which slowly limits your room, but it really just looks like another tank and spank. But then the boss reaches 100 energy and you realize it was all a lie. That's because the raid-wide AoE of the boss went from coming every 10 seconds to coming every 5 seconds once it hit 100 energy. And that basically is unhealable. It forces you to keep rolling your healing raid cooldowns, bloodlust, and eventually anything you have just to survive the incoming damage. The key to this fight was not actually focusing on phase 3, but going back to phase 1 and 2 and figuring out how to get through them as quickly as possible so that you enter phase 3 with the boss having as little energy as possible. Overall, a great but quite deceptive fight to progress on. Moving on to number 2, we have BLACKHAND, my number 1 favorite end boss. And that's probably because of the fact that it was only a 9-minute fight. But in reality, it was such an extremely intense fight from start to finish, giving us the illusion more of a 15-minute fight. Too many times end bosses are exhausting to progress on due to the boring time sinks of phase 1 or phase 2 or even both, but BLACKHAND didn't have any of that. Phase 1 was a super tight 2-minute DPS check where we had to dodge the debris coming from the ceiling, and we ended up doing 360s around the boss while making full use of the sadly now removed aspect of the fox. The DPS requirement was ridiculous, especially because we needed to use Bloodlust in phase 3 and since it was a sub 10-minute fight, that meant that we couldn't use it in phase 1. At 70%, BLACKHAND smashes the floor and we go into phase 2. Now here's a fun fact, we actually didn't realize for the longest time that you could soak up the fire that comes from the sky at the start of phase 2 by simply standing on them, and thought that this phase is just ridiculous because there's just fire everywhere. Until we subbed one player in the raid and he instantly just asked, well, have you tried soaking them or... Anyway, phase 2 was very interesting as it gave you the option to choose the rotation of the 4 different types of siege makers, the tanks that you kite around, by strategically positioning the boss across the room. It was also very important to have a comp able to kill the archers on the balconies quickly, as they became stronger and stronger the longer they stayed alive, and eventually they killed off your raid. Now this phase wasn't as intense as phase 1, but it did require a lot of planning and trial and error while picking the correct order of siege makers. Eventually we reached 30% and entered phase 3. Phase 3 was quite similar to phase 1 in the sense that it was a big DPS check, but it had a few additions. First, you had to soak some debris that spawned semi-randomly around the room, and you needed immunities to do so. Secondly, you needed more and more healing for the bleed dots. And thirdly, you had volcanoes spawning, limiting your room and eventually covering the whole area. So it was basically a kill it before it kills you situation, which led up to an incredible climax and some of the best nerd screams when we finally managed to get the kill. Finally, we have our #1 hardest boss in WoD, and it's none other than ARCHIMONDE. A fight that you can only describe as epic. It had everything. DPS checks, crazy mechanics, and even a secret mythic-only last phase. Now the main mechanic throughout the whole fight that caused us the most trouble was Doomfire. It was simply dealing too much damage, and even after Blizzard hotfixed it to deal around half of what it used to, we still had to push phase 1 DPS before ARCHIMONDE spawned the 4th Doomfire orb. Otherwise it was simply too much to handle in phase 2. Other than that, phase 1 was simply maneuvering around the room while min-maxing and bringing the boss down to 70%. Going into phase 2, we still had to deal with the Doomfire, dodge some spirits and kill some ads, but let's face it, the most interesting ability was of course the laser beams. Going from 1 laser in Heroic to 10 lasers in Mythic meant that we had to come up with a completely different strategy. Or so we thought. We initially tried a lot of positions, making 2 lines, a circle, hell, even an egg. But while we were trying all of this, we were also improving our weak aura, the famous method radar, which eventually allowed us to just say at some point, let's just YOLO it and see how it goes. And it actually worked. Of course, this caused some controversy, and ever since Blizzard has decided to take a hard stance on weak auras, because they thought that it just went too far. Regardless, we finally got in phase 3 the secret phase. And the secret phase was just epic, being in the Twisting Nether and all, which by the way was also our server name back then. You had the Seething Corruption, which was the most fun ability in that phase, and it forced us to dance, and also it brought back some nice memories from Hagen back in Naxxramas. It was quite fun trying to figure out all of the dancing patterns that you had to learn in order to dodge all the fire on the ground. But the main threat of that phase were definitely the Infernals. They came in waves, each time increasing in number, and eventually you just hit a timing where it was a soft enrage, as you simply couldn't realistically kill them all off before they started exploding and wiping your raid. Definitely a great fight, and probably one of the hardest ones in all of WoW's history. Moving on to the honorable mentions of this expansion, we suddenly only have one for WoD, and it goes to the Butcher. theoretically the second boss in high mode, and with very simple mechanics, but a very tight 4-minute enrage timer. Of course, as guilds got more and more gear, the fight got quite trivialized, but at the time of release, it was no joke. And you needed the perfect try with some good RNG on the DPS procs to get the kill. To give you an idea of how hard it was, Paragon even opted to skip the boss completely, as it was an optional one, and go straight for Margok, the last boss of the raid, first. And that about wraps up this video, guys. You can find the full method kill video links of these bosses in the description below, and let me know in the comments if you want to see more of these videos for the other expansions in the future. This has been Rogerbrown, thanks for watching, and have a good one.